Welcome, everyone, to an episode of the Lectern. I'm John Vervaeke. I'm joined by somebody who's been my ongoing partner in this kind of work, and somebody I've known for quite a while, and who I think is one of the sweetest people I've met in my life, and also just brilliant, and that's Mark Miller. Some of you also know, of course, the remarkable Rick Repetti, somebody who has become a close friend of mine as well. And he has often been my companion. We did a whole series together on issues around meditation and mindfulness, and that will be the topic that's in discussion today. And then we are joined by somebody many of you don't know, and that's Jonas Mago. And welcome here. And I'm going to let Mark introduce Jonas, set us up a little bit more specific for this episode. But I want to give everybody a chance to just quickly say hello to everybody, and then we'll begin.
Excellent. Thanks, John. So I am so excited about this. This is, we decided to do this series after I was on Philosophy of Meditation with Rick and John. And I ran a course this past year on predictive processing, active inference, and meditation, and got to touch with sort of all the best people in the world on this topic, and thought this would just be such a great offering. And John and I are doing research on predictive processing and relevance realization right now, which is so importantly related to contemplative programs like attention training and awareness training and all of these things, that we just thought this was a really good mashup. So this is our first episode doing this. And we invited Jonas Mago, who's just an absolute rising star. If you don't know Jonas, you need to know him soon. His research is excellent. He is a PhD candidate at McGill University, working under Michael Lifshitz, who is, again, just an incredible young researcher. And Jonas is a good meditation friend of mine, so we practice deeply together. He's one of the few people, I don't know, John or Rick, if I told you this, but there's only a handful of people who are doing predictive processing, contemplative science, who are contemplatives. And I mean in a serious way, not just in a sort of dilettante way, but a serious meditator. And Jonas is one of these people, so it's a delight working with him because he has this sort of insider perspective as well as this third-person scientific perspective, which I hope we can get into a little bit today. But in addition to all of that, the reason I wanted to get Jonas on here for the first episode is that right now, Jhana, and if you're not familiar with that at home, we're going to get familiar with it in this episode. Jhana practices, these absorption practices, are really they're a hot topic today. Vox just did a popular article on Jhana, calling it a panic attack and ecstasy or something. So you're getting a lot of buzz right now about Jhana in the world. There's a lot of bad science being done around Jhana, and Jonas is one of the few people in the world who's doing really good science on the science of Jhana, and he's using predictive processing as the framework and actually doing EEG studies on monks and on the best of the Jhana practitioners in North America. So it's really exciting work. So I just can't wait to sort of jump into this with you, Jonas. So welcome.
Well, I'll just briefly say hello to everybody. John said he wanted us all to introduce ourselves. I'm Rick Repetti. It's been mentioned I met Mark on the Philosophy of Meditation podcast. That was our last episode. So this is nice, the first one. Continuing, kind of picking up that thread.
Yeah, it's a nice link.
Yeah, and I'm really happy to be a part of this. And I want to thank you, Mark, for saying, hey, let's do this. Rick, do you want to be a part of it? I said, absolutely. The three of you are cognitive scientists. I'm not. I'm just a philosopher and a long-term meditator. That's my bag. But I think I know enough about this to contribute. And thanks for having me. Good to see you guys, and good to meet you, Jonas. Great work that I read about so far.
Yeah, likewise. Great to meet you, Rick, John, Mark. Good to be on a podcast with all of you. And Mark, thank you for that incredible, beautiful introduction that you gave me here. I think we get much deeper into my work throughout this next hour or so. But a few things that Mark pointed out is I'm doing my PhD right now, a PhD in neuroscience at McGill University, supervised by Michael Lifshitz and co-supervised by Carl Friston in London. And what I'm doing with my work is really Michael's work on these contemplative practices, in my case, most predominantly Buddhist meditation techniques, specifically jhana, but also we work with charismatic prayers and other spiritual practices, and look at these practices both from a phenomenological point. So microphenomenology and interviewing techniques play a big part in our research group, but then also from the neurosciences to see what's actually happening in the brain and the body, and then have some theoretical framework that can bridge both the neuroscience as well as the phenomenology. And a big intention of mine is to use this predictive coding, active inference framework as the translating piece between both the physiology and the phenomenology. And right now I'm doing it on these expert jhana meditators. I'm some of the most experienced jhana meditators in North America.
Yeah, wow. Could you maybe lay out a little bit for us what jhana is, if people don't know?
Totally. There's meditation is like this vast field with all kinds of different practices, and there's different ways of cluster them and classifying them. One dimension that I find interesting to look at in the context of jhana is we often speak of metacognition being the central aspect of meditation. So the idea is you have some experience going on and you want to cultivate this metacognitive awareness to notice yourself as this changing sensory phenomena, experiential blurb thing, which you make up to be yourself. And so many traditions can be understood in developing these metacognitive skills. That's also important for the jhana practices. But here, instead of developing this meta-awareness of all sensory phenomena, jhana is an attention practice where you try to refine attention so much that you focus on a single object to the exclusion of all other experiences. There's a few different ways of going into it. The tradition we work with is the tradition of Park Sayadaw, and thanks to Dharma College Berkeley, we were able to be introduced to Shaila Catherine, who is kind of carrying that lineage in North America. And so there, the idea is you focus on the breath, and at some point the concentration gets so fine, so subtle, that a certain joy arises, and with that joy there comes a certain light phenomena, which is called a nimitta. And then you have this light phenomena which you notice, and then you focus on this light phenomena because it's even more pure than the breath, because it's a mentally created object and not a physical sensation. And then you focus on this light, which then creates more joy, which is called piti. Then you take this piti as the object, which is even more refined. It's even more of a kind of mentally created object. And then there's 8 distinct stages of refining this concentration. And it's called an absorption because these states at some point get so joyous, so beautiful that you don't need to kind of push your mind to stay on those, but it's just this almost relaxing into them, and you can just make space for this joy to grow. And it's an absorption experience because all other experiences just fade. So you still would wake up if someone kind of shakes you, or if someone is like, hey, come on, stop your meditation or whatever. But other than these extreme cases, you're just not aware of any other experiences than these kind of concentration objects.
Rick or John, do you guys have experience with jhana practice? Have you ever done this?
When I was training for Vipassana, we went through a period where we were just focusing on the breath, and then we were doing, an analytic kind of thing where you're focusing in on very detailed aspects like these particular sensations. But that was as far as I've had any practice with it.
Rick, have you done these jhanas before?
Yeah, but not in the Buddhist lens. And my original several years of practice, it was yogic one-pointedness, which is functionally almost the same thing. Just everything else disappears, and these are jhana-like states.
Yeah. I've worked with the jhanas before, and it's pretty remarkable that you can have such powerful joy, bone breaking joy can arise. And it's the only thing that's left. I mean, the only experience that's left in the mind is just this incredible joy. No wonder it's becoming popular. I remember Daniel Ingram said in his book that if he knew about jhanas early on, he would have never done drugs. Because if you could tap this internal stream of joy, then why would you ever have turned to to alcohol or drugs. But of course, lots of warnings in the literature as well about tapping these kinds of big reward-inducing states as well. Yeah.
So, Jonas, I was asking the question. We've sort of talked at least briefly about the phenomenology and the affect, but I'm interested in the sort of what are the purported sapiential cognitive functions that are supposed to be developed by doing this kind of practice.
Yeah, love that. And maybe I have a little preamble here before, because much of what I'm going to say falls under this preamble, which is there's a big debate of how important these states actually are for the development of insight. So there's different lineages within the jhana traditions of how central the jhanas are for the path of awakening. And between Buddhist traditions, some Buddhist traditions use them a little bit, others use them a lot, and other traditions don't use them that much. So there's like, depending on which tradition you ask, there will be slightly different answer.
Literally called the Jhana Wars today. Sometimes they just say the Jhana Wars because there's so much contention about what the Buddha meant and how lineages today see this.
Yeah, totally. But I'll speak a little bit from the view of assuming that, or like this idea of jhanas being essential for this path of awakening, and thinking about what that can mean from a cognitive lens. And that's work and Mark and I have been thinking through and kind of discussing over the past few months and almost years by now. And that's this idea that what we're trying in meditation is starting to model our predictive hierarchy of the brain opaque. So to notice that experience ultimately is not something that's kind of a real grasp on reality, that all we have is this imprint of reality on our experiential or generative modeling through this predictive hierarchy. And sometimes what you want to do is to be able to model your perceptual system as a kind of data crunching system. But usually perception is such a complex phenomena that it becomes rather complex, if not impossible, to notice or look at experience as a sensory phenomena. In the classic Vipassana ideas, you turn your look towards your own thoughts, notice thoughts as a sensory phenomena. In usual experience is complex, is vast in different dimensions. And what happens in these jhana stages, you will find you simplify experience. You simplify experience to such a degree that it becomes a super simple object to look at. Like all of experience, consciousness as a whole, becomes as simple as a little breath wave. And if we think from a kind of predictive coding perspective, you now have an object that is so simple that you can much more easily develop this metacognitive layers to model your experience, and thereby ultimately understand that even consciousness is, or like the merging of consciousness is not this constant phenomena, but it's like a rising and passing phenomena depending on how your inferential relationship to the world is unfolding from moment to moment.
Can I add a layer there, John, in case you didn't catch it? Think about how cool this is. If there's benefit to modeling your model, okay, so all the power you get by the system not only self-evidencing naturally in the world, but learning about itself as a modeling system, which gains, you get all these new layers of optimization, all these new abilities of freedom, as soon as the system knows that it's a modeling system. The problem, though, is the system's too complex. Generative model's too complex. So one of the things you might need for, if that's one of the factors of awakening, is you need to simplify the model. And we have these contemplative technologies that simplify the amount of information that the model's modeling, so that you might get a chance to glimpse the actual modeling structure itself in its more simplified state. It's a really interesting hypothesis.
So I want to go in because there's a potential equivocation there, but I don't think you're making one. It sounds to me like you're saying, like, we have this very complex modeling process, and normally it's dealing with a complex object. It's not so much that you simplified the modeling, you simplify the object, and the complex modeling is now running, but now you can devote resources to that complexity as opposed to the complexity of the object that's usually being modeled. Did I get it right then?
I love that. Yeah, I love that reframing, John. I think that gets at the core of this idea here.
I just wanted to say that because we were talking modeling and we're slipping, we can be equivocating when we're saying modeling between the process of modeling and that which is modeled. And I just want to be very clear what you're saying. And so if that landed well, I can appreciate that. And then the idea is that you get sort of abilities to track this complexity. Is that the idea?
I think that's the idea. The idea is that you then, so doing the jhana itself, there's a bit of a questioning of how much metacognition there's there. You don't, like, phenomenologically, there isn't a lot of like being, like reflecting and noticing what these states are that you're experiencing. A very, very central, and probably the central experience and moment for the insight generation is once you have been in jhana, in these absorption states for a while, and once the experience re-emerges.
You're doing this, but then when you sort of stop the practice, as your phenomenology comes back, you have this enhanced metacognitive ability. Is that what you were saying? It's just that the thread dropped. Is that what you were arguing?
What happens is when you end the phase of this deep absorption, at some point you come out and re-emerge, and you notice experience slowly building up again. So you slowly notice how the world comes back as a more and more complex phenomena. And you can now be aware of how you internally rebuild the model of the world by layers and layers of complexity of the world re-emerging.
Oh, I see.
Now you can notice, now you can be an observer of this
so the idea is
complexifying of the world, which is ultimately a perceptual phenomena, much more than an actual, like nothing in the world around you changes.
I get that. So again, we're dealing with your feed being a little bit chunky, but so you've got this rebound period, if I could put it that, and then you get to sort of revisit how this complex model was built in a fashion. You get to see it sort of recomplexifying sort of before your eyes. Obviously, like you said, but it's not a hallucination. You're seeing that in conjunction with the way your perception's unfolding. Is that correct?
Totally. That's exactly the idea, John. And there is another way, a bit of a different lens that we can take to also look at this, which is a slightly different idea, but expresses the same underlying principle. And that's the rigidity of priors that we hold in our cognitive architecture. So in usual perception, we rely pretty heavily on our priors and expectations that we have around the world. And those are kind of shaping and classifying and categorizing experiences into objects that we can interact with. In these jhana states, you start reducing your prediction towards a single object. Nothing else becomes interesting. So all you need to anticipate is the unfolding of this object, which is first the breath, then the nimitta, then the piti. So the usually rather complex prior landscape is now unifying to only having a single prior on a single experience. And mathematically, the priors, they're normalized. So once you ramp up precision or attention or awareness on a single object, all other priors get relatively downweight. And you stay like that with the flattened prior landscape for the time you're in this absorption state. And by the time you end the meditation, slowly all the other priors build up again to allow you to come back to a perceptual experience that's kind of a bit more of our ordinary day-to-day experience. And
so that's really interesting. I mean, one thing you're going to learn there then is you're going to learn that the depth of the generative model isn't essential. It's transient, right? We normally think like the future and the past are these really real entities. The system is assuming that. It's building up a predictive landscape, assuming that depth is real, that there really is a future to predict and there really are things in the past we should predict from. But if you can simplify that model and turn it back on again and simplify it and turn it back on again and simplify it and turn it back and on again, then you might be able to, it's like you're looking under the hood. You start realizing, oh wait, these things I was taking very seriously, actually they change all the time. They can deconstruct, they can reconstruct. I just hear already, that sounds insightful to me to notice that, yes, there is a future and yes, there is a past, but maybe the system can hold it a little bit lighter because sometimes it turns on and sometimes it turns off. We see the same thing in psychedelics research, don't we?
Yeah.
I wanted to suggest two things. One is when you reduce everything to one object, one focal range, you quiet everything else. So there's a lot of lucidity and mental clarity from which you can then perceive what's going on when it starts to come back. Number one.
That's right.
Number two, you're making this simplicity and this mental clarity highly salient, right? By focusing on it. Attention gives it a life of its own, right? So there's something that's like a luminosity. And then with that nimitta thing, I wonder if there's a connection there. But there's a luminosity to awareness, which is focused, which everybody who's practiced this experiences this heightened lucidity of, mental clarity and quiescence and all that sort of thing. That's kind of like turning the lights on and then seeing everything else. When you come out of that, everything is a lot more visible to you.
Yeah.
And a third thing is exercising those abilities is generic. It's a kind of generic skill that spills over into an executive ability to control a lot of the other phenomena as they roll back in. Because you're isolating and capturing the motor control, like the steering wheel of attention. And then
in a really powerful way.
Yes.
In a really powerful
You're grabbing almost like the direct core of the executive control feature by exercising attentional control.
And I think an important point, especially in this predictive processing kind of lineage, is to think about what the role is of these priors. And in some ways, they upregulate perception and accuracy on certain phenomena you look at, but they also have a huge numbing effect on all the things that you do not want to perceive. So ultimately, this whole expectation-driven perception, which is ordinary experience, is just cutting out so much of what we could experience if we wouldn't kind of numb out all these things that are distracting. So in one sense, this luminosity could possibly arise from the idea of temporarily pausing this pushing away, this exclusion from things that aren't interesting, that are distracting or whatever. And you have this upsurge of now new experience that you previously haven't even considered as being interesting. And this upsurge of bottom-up information and now perception of all kinds of little things that you can't yet classify or can't put into any categories. But there's this huge influx of information, and that is possibly associated to this feeling of joy, of pity, of beauty in some way.
So that raises up, and you alluded to this at one point, that raises up an issue because, of course, this is overlaps with relevance realization work. Ignoring most of the world is massively adaptive. I don't want to pay attention to the combinatorial explosive amount of information that's available to me, or it's the last thing I'm going to do. And so when you are now opening your, if you'll allow me some of my language, when you're now opening yourself up to the combinatorial explosion, what is the counterbalance? Like, how do you ramp up the relevance realization so you're not just, right? I think, there's a potential here for, well, I don't know if this maps totally, but people who have the trait absorption are much more capable of schizotypical behavior in which they see patterns that aren't there and all kinds of pathological phenomena. And I could see opening myself up to a lot of bottom-up, unfiltered stuff could make me potentially vulnerable.
Psychedelics.
I'm not making. Pardon me.
As with psychedelics.
Right. And the problem with psychedelics is if you don't have a sapiential framework around them, people tunnel into, nobody gets addicted. Yes, they do. They get addicted to their rabbit hole metaphysics. And they go down crazy pathways and tunnels. And so I'm assuming, because I don't know very much about this tradition, that there's a huge sapiential framework around this that is designed to provide guidance, normative guidance for people about how to properly reframe in the presence of this explosion of possible things that they could find interesting or that could be worthy of their attention.
Two important things, and I bet, Mark, you have much to add as well. The one important thing is the value that you want to have from these jhana states is not the experience as such. So the idea is not to train jhana to then be in this constant bottom-up driven experiential state, because as you say, it's a highly non-functional state to do work, to be in the world. The idea is you want to temporarily be in that state to learn something about how your cognitive system works. that you can use that insight to then relate differently to yourself and to the world once you're back to a kind of more regulated and kind of prior driven, constrained and contextualized world. And this is also the other point is that's probably one of the major risks that these jhana states have. There is in a ton of literature in the Buddhist canons, way more than what I have read, than what I have known. And I need to defer to like Buddhist scholars also that know the literature much more, because there's so much guidance, so much precision. These states have been refined to such a fine degree of kind of giving pointers of what's the right path to follow, where do you kind of fall off. And one way where you can fall off is you can start getting addicted to these states, just like possibly to psychedelics, where it becomes such a joyous experience to be in these pity-rich states that you mistake these pity things for the goal, while you miss that there's something just next to it of kind of learning something that you can take back to ordinary experience. And so that's the one of the main kind of markers that the teachers I've worked with often pointed out.
So there is this framework around about don't get sort of addicted to the joy,
yeah.
Oh, huge.
right? And try to and then try to learn about your framing process, if I can use that language.
And actually, the Buddha ran into the same problem, right? The traditional story of the Buddha was he went to a jhana teacher to start with. The jhana teacher took him up to the 7th jhana, and he mastered the 7th very, very lofty jhana. And then he came out and said, okay, well, I've mastered it. Now what? And the teacher goes, no, there's no now what. Now you sit in the cave and you go up to the 7th and you hang out with God. And then you just stay there. Don't worry about eating. Don't worry about sleeping. Just sort of stay there. And the Buddha was like, well, that's for the dogs, because like when I come out of this, I'm still suffering. I still don't understand my condition. I still don't understand the world. So he went to another teacher who then takes him up to the 8th jhana and says, now you've really got it. The Buddha says, well, what do I do now? And he goes, well, just hang out there. Just get close. Just snuggle right up to God and hang out. And he goes, well, that can't be it, because I keep coming down. And then like Ram Dass says, like I sober up and then I'm not with God anymore. So I got to find a way to stay high. And now you just chase the high, which is really the worry here. But the Buddha did the smart thing, which was he took this technology and started going up and down layers of complexity and watching what is the nature of, and I'm freewheeling on my own. Okay. What is the nature of the construction process? And the way to get free of some of this is to recognize, well, this is constructed and here is how it gets constructed. Yeah.
Yeah.
One beautiful, I wish I could draw like little diagram, but one like diagram that I have in my head often is that there is this simplifying experiences through the jhanas comes with a stronger and stronger insight into the emptiness of experience. And in the emptiness of experience, what I mean is that experience is ultimately constructed, kind of noticing by observing your own experience that you construct the reality that you perceive, at least to some degree. And
could you say that again? We lost, it was a crucial piece. We lost your definition of emptiness of experience.
Wonderful.
That is a crucial piece. Let's hear it again.
Yeah. And again, it's a definition for this context mostly. So that emptiness is the ability to notice how your own generative model or your own predictive hierarchy is constructing your experience of the surrounding sensory data, to notice the inbuilt construction that is going on. And once you notice it, then you're somewhat liberated from these phenomena because you notice that you have agency over them to some degree. And that is a lot simpler once experience is simple. So in these absorptive jhana states, it's a lot simpler to notice how your mind generates them. And then the trick is to then allow experience to be more and more complex again, and keep this insight into the translucidity, into the emptiness of these experiences, up to the complexity of ordinary life. And it's this journey back where ultimately you could have just gone from experience into noticing the emptiness of experience, but taking this bypass to the simplified experience and then coming back is one that the Theravadan tradition is centrally built upon.
Can I just a small hook out of here? You've actually done EEG research on monastics and on masters of this tradition. What are you finding? I mean, what do we find when we look under the hood, and then how does it sort of link back into this discussion about usefulness?
Totally. So the primary study is in North America with 10 Jhana meditators that practice in this Park Sayadaw tradition, so one of the deeper traditions. And the most interesting finding is that we played an oddball task to them. So we just played a bunch of sounds, and sometimes we vary. There was a variation in the sound, which evokes something called a surprisal response. And what we then did is compared how does the surprisal response look when people do jhana meditation, so on these absorptive states, compared to if they do mindfulness meditation, mindfulness of breath. In a mindfulness of breath, you're already really concentrated. These are very experienced, even mindfulness practitioners. And what we find is that in the jhana meditation, they still notice the sound, there's still a response from the auditory cortex, but the surprisal response is getting very, very small or possibly fading altogether. And so what this shows us is that in these jhana meditations, the practitioners still perceive experiences, but they don't engage with this, comparing this current experience to the past or to the future. They don't track experience. The temporal horizon of perceptions, just like Rick just did, is shrinking and shrinking so much that at some point, this meaning making that happens over the temporal integration is collapsing.
So I didn't hear the one point I've read it, but I just want to get it out there. I mean, not in contrast to control, but like I know some of the research that mindfulness practitioners also show a difference compared to controls with novel sound. So like what's the specific difference? It didn't quite come through. I know you said it, but it didn't come through.
So the main difference is that in the response to the surprising sound, there's different components, but they can roughly be simplified into one component that's a very early, like 100 milliseconds into the experience. That's a component of just perceiving a sound. Around 300 milliseconds, there is another component that is now realizing that this sound is different to previous sounds, that there's some violation from the expectations that would have been built up over listening to the sound for the past 10, 15, 20 minutes. During jhana meditation, the second component, which is indicative of tracking time and noticing violations of patterns, this component is fading. It's either getting small or fading completely. Which basically proves, or like it's evidence for our idea that the temporal model, the temporal depth, the pattern tracking, which happens in these more prior landscapes rather than the sensory domains, is shrinking down. And there is a weighing away from conceptual pattern tracking towards sensory experience in the very moment to moment experience.
Now, what I love about this is it's the first chance that we've really had to look under the hood and prove in a scientific way that people in absorption states literally are absorbed. You have people give you this first personal phenomenology, say, look, when I hit this pocket, when I hit this altered state pocket, because it really does feel like a pocket, I'm gone. All there is the simplified qualities left. It's just joy and concentration. I don't have a body. I don't have thoughts. Metacognition is largely missing. There's no room. There's no sounds. That's the report. How do you know? What we actually look under the hood, and part of Jonas's research is we can actually see, indeed, and even relative to just mindfulness, that there is a distinct difference between being mindful of an object and so ignoring everything else, and being absorbed in an object such that you are now in an altered state where these differences aren't featuring. And part of the answer here might be because you have no temporal horizon, you have no capability right now to complexify or to conceptualize that information. Pretty amazing.
I remember reading Kasulis, I forget his first name, Zen Action, Zen Person, years ago, in the 70s, quoted a study by Olten and Noonberg, where they took these Zen practitioners their practice was all about ceaseless responsiveness, and they had a control group, and they did something with surprises with slight changes in sounds and patterns. Like, so they chose a certain light sequence and sound sequence, and then maybe every 20 seconds it would repeat. And the ordinary folks kept responding to it. There was a difference between the Zen ones. They were responding to everything that happened, even though it was repeating. All right. The Jhana folks.
It was always fresh.
Yeah.
It was always fresh. They always had beginner's mind.
Yeah. I have the reference for it. If you're interested, I'll forward it to you. Because that's the opposite of the Jhana thing. And so these different techniques, they really do different things. They really do some amazing stuff.
Right. Well, that's powerful. I'm wondering then, this sounds phenomenologically similar, but it sounds also functionally different from things like the pure consciousness event. What would be the difference then? Because typically that's how that's described. It's contentless. There's no metacognition. I'm not even conscious of consciousness. I'm just conscious.
Can I just add one thing from the tradition, quick?
Please.
One traditional thing there, John, is the functionality of metacognition. That in pure awareness there is a knowing. There is a knowing capability. Usually, I'm observing. In the Jhana, that tends to be missing. The other thing is Jhana is very transient. It's something that you fall into and pop out of, rather than.
I want to push back on you, Mark.
Tell me.
Because if there's no knowing, you would black out. You wouldn't have a memory of it. Agreed.
There's pre-reflexive knowing. That's right. Exactly.
Right. And then I would say back to you, I think that's all that's going on in the pure consciousness event as well. Right. So I'm trying to get, is there a phenomenological difference, or is this a different way of getting to the same, sorry for this metaphor, place? I'm not sure.
John,
this is an open question. I'm unsure.
For the pure consciousness, is that an extended time or also a temporally constrained phenomenon as you think about it?
Thomas Metzinger's book just came out about this, The Elephant and the Blind, but it's over 500 cases that he discusses of pure consciousness experiences from among thousands that he researched. But I didn't get through the whole book, so I can't really answer what the taxonomy is to differentiate these things.
Wonderful. So I think a big part here is where I just need to be incredibly humble, that having worked with different contemplative traditions in our work, but also there's so many more that I haven't touched. There is just, each tradition has its slightly different North Star and the experience that they idolize as being the important experience. And I find it really hard to know how similar or different they are. The guess that I can do for these Jhana states is they're probably very similar to what Thomas Metzinger calls the minimal phenomenological experience. An experience that's stripped away from any complexity, any conceptuality, towards like a pure experience. And how the Jhanas would understand it is, it's a pure experience that's so close to the object that you even don't notice the object anymore. It's like zooming in so much that it's like you're kind of in this like subtle, joyous vibration territory. I could imagine that other traditions, and there's ways of understanding minimal phenomenological experience where you can still have some objects that you experience and you just experience in some pure way. That's, I think, where the Jhanas might just be a little bit different, where the content in the Jhanas is highly pre-specified, and it's only a Jhana if it's so close to experience, combined with this specific phenomenology of these 8 distinct Jhana stages.
So we can't let you go, and I think this is a nice bridge for this, because you're talking now about the diversity of tradition. I don't think we can let you go without tapping some of your work comparing altered states in the Buddhist contemplative program and the Christian, for instance, speaking in tongues contemplative program, right? That we have these altered states across different traditions. And you've done some fMRI and some EEG work looking at and trying to find some shared roots, I think, between the sort of Buddhist contemplative and Christian prayerful or contemplative traditions. I'd love to sort of tap this before we say goodbye too.
I'd love to get into that.
Do you have any roots in this, Rick? Rick, do you have any love for the Christian contemplative tradition? I do, in a big way.
Well, I was raised a Catholic, but that's not charismatic. But I'm familiar with it, and I know people who are, and I read Lerman's book about when God talks back, all this kind of stuff. It's fascinating to me. And my father told me that when he was a young man, he was a merchant marine. He was in New Orleans. He went to a local church for a service, and they were speaking in tongues. And so I've heard a lot of things about it. I've always been curious about it. I've never really quite known. I meant to look this up before we came here today. What the original biblical Jesus folks who were like the apostles went out after the Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came in,
that's right,
and they spoke in tongues. This seemed to me some kind of telepathic thing. Wherever they went, people understood them. I'm not sure what that was. But what this is like some kind of a spiritual scat jazz kind of thing where you just
autodidactic.
Yeah, you just kind of open up and like the spirit comes through you. And I wonder if there's a multimodal sensory thing there too, because hearing, speaking, touching, feeling, it's like this whole orgiastic thing. I think of the Sufis dancing, all sorts of things come to mind, tribal dance. The research that I just read about that you're doing is just phenomenal, Jonas. Sorry. So go ahead, man.
I love hearing that, Rick. And I love that you mentioned Tanya Luhrmann's work, When God Speaks Back. Much of this Christian work is emerged in the group of Tanya Luhrmann with my supervisor, Michael Lifshitz, and Joshua Brahinsky, who's been working with these Christians for a decade or two at this point, a long, long time. And I was lucky to kind of join them in the research in the fMRI. We recently completed a big EEG study on these states. And we're now in the phase of analyzing the data as well. Before going into the data, I think an important thing here is I can speak about what we find in the physiology and how we think about it from a modeling perspective. While I also want to acknowledge that both the Buddhist tradition and the Christian tradition, they are the closed systems where within the system, people have their own ways of speaking around it. And so they use different words. So I can't do justice to both of these communities when taking this meta perspective. And I think it's important to have this language within a community. But I also think it's important to zoom out a little bit and think about what's going on between these communities here a little bit. And so one of the most striking phenomenological findings that we're seeing here is that both speaking in tongues and jhana meditation is this high arousal contemplative practice. So often we think of contemplation and meditation as being this silent thing where everything is kind of calm and it's so calm that experience fades more and more. But what's happening in jhana, you have this intense pity where people kind of feel really shaken up by it. And the same happens in the charismatic Christians when they speak. And I was lucky to join them in their churches a few times, and we were praying together and they were praying over me. And even just being there a few times, I just noticed how my whole nervous system just gets activated. And there's like this really strong experience of like something is happening. Some effect is happening on my body, on my mind, on my experience. And I just think that's striking for that being a contemplative practice that's so intense. And now the question that we're asking going forward, and we're not completely done with the data yet, we have the suspicion that both the jhana meditation and the speaking in tongues lends itself a little bit to generating some insight. And the idea is it's probably in both cases similar, that you get so obsessed, you get so in love, you fall so much in love with single experience, which we discussed earlier, that you temporarily abandon experience of all other phenomena to then notice how other phenomena come back into your experiential world. And if that's a meditation object, if that's pity, if that's the experience of God speaking through you, if that's a Sufi dance, if that's poetry, if that's music, it might not be so important which of these objects is the one that captures your mind and your attention to the degree where you can get so close and fall so much in love with experience. And I think there might be an opportunity to find friendships and connections between contemplative practices that often seem very far apart.
Sorry, I was gone for a bit. My signal dropped.
Welcome back.
We seem to be bedeviled by. I think I might have missed the thing I was most looking forward to talking to. But this has all been very fascinating. Which is, I remember in some discussions we had with you and Mark that I wanted to ask you about testing some of these people on insight capacities, and maybe that's what you were talking about. I don't know, because I'm particularly interested in the degree to which these practices, however different they might be, which you were pointing to, they might have common functionality in terms of helping people get better at breaking inappropriate frame and be open to reframing, larger framing, insight kind of experience.
Totally.
So, pardon me if I just missed it, but I just wanted to.
No, I think, John, this is a perfect segue. We're just introducing the concept of comparing Jhana to the work we do with the charismatic Christian people, and I just spoke a bit about the idea that both of them are similar in falling so in love with the object that you temporarily abandon other sensory experience, and that there might be what they have in common is that allows some cognitive flexibility that allows you to change. And I think that's what's so close to the possibility of generating insight or possible awakening experiences.
So can I add something quick there, Jonas? Just something that comes up. One phrase that we haven't brought up today, which seems really relevant, is bad bootstraps, which is pretty common in the predictive processing literature right now. Bad bootstrap is this local minima that feels good to be in. It feels like you have a good grip on your scene, but it's not a good grip. It's actually a bad grip. It's a bad grip, sort of giving you the feeling of being a good grip, and that's because it's sort of good enough. You get frozen in that, and there can be all sorts of benefit to temporarily lowering all of the prior landscape so that you can maybe check out some other possibilities that are available with the hope that you find a better local minima or you find a better grip. So like addiction, depression can be thought of as sort of suboptimal grips. They're good. Addiction is one way of dealing with a niche. I mean, it is one way of dealing with it. It's just a bad way because over time it actually hurts the predictive system rather than help it. So there can be just one thing we haven't mentioned, but it just keeps featuring here, temporarily ignoring everything else, all of your other prior landscape, and then having it turn back on again. Sounds a lot like what we're seeing in psychedelics, where you're having this temporary flattening, which allows you some escape velocity, which sounds also to me the way that John talks about insight, being able to come over that entropy wave and then into a better understanding and just lowering the threshold for that.
Well, if I can pick up on that, because there seems to be a growing convergence between many different things about, like, even in machine learning, you overfit to the data, you lock into a local minima, you throw noise into the system, just noise, and it breaks the system up enough, and so you're no longer overfit. And I'm wondering, I'm not trying to be reductive here. I really appreciate the subtlety of the work being done here. I want to emphasize that. But it sounds to me like please hear the word, one of the important things going on here is something like, a temporary some sort of practice that temporarily increases entropy, the way the psychedelics do, in order to get a long-term reduction in entropy in the system, or something like that. Does that land?
That's great. Theoretically, that's very much the hypothesis we work under, that we think to see here. It's still there's still a bit more data to be looked at. But one interesting cognitive task that we've done with the Jhana people is where we've tried to measure this not in the brain, but measure it in their cognitive way of in their cognitive flexibility. And we used something that's called a divergent association task, where we asked them to give us 10 words that are as different as possible. And they just note down the
semantic
words.
Difference, distance. Semantic distance, you're calling it.
Yeah.
Semantic distance, difference, whichever. And it's like you analyze this by so you get these 10 words, and then you have this this algorithm which is trained on thousands of books comparing how often are words named together, or is it very uncommon in our language to name them together. And what you find, or what we would expect, is the more distant the words are, the more or the less constrained the cognition is to usual ways of thinking, and the more creative it is, the more open it is to perceiving the world in new ways. And what we find is that after people get out of jhana meditation, they show greater semantic distance between words than after mindfulness meditation, which is very likely already much greater than after not meditating at all.
Yeah.
So we're comparing two states here that are already a bit on the one end of the spectrum. And ultimately that is a cognitive measure of something that is probably assimilating entropy, both experientially and likely what we find is that it correlates with entropy in the brain as well.
Yeah. There is quite a bit of evidence that mindfulness practices enhance insight. So the fact that the Jhana practice you've got some preliminary but good evidence that it's even going beyond that as a benchmark. That's impressive.
Exactly.
Now, the issue always, of course, with insight is the issue of transfer, right? Doing the 9-dot problem doesn't transfer to a lot of other. You want systematic. You want the kinds of insights that will generalize to many different contexts, and also systemic. They'll generalize to many different layers of cognition. Are you thinking about how to potentially look for that?
Yeah, and that's, I think, given that I'm situated in the Department of Cultural Psychiatry, we think a lot about the context that culture has in these things.
Right.
And we just spoke about the similarity of these practices across different traditions. But what I also find striking is the consequences that people take from these practices seem to be highly culturally patterned.
Yeah.
So people get into these high entropy states where they're able to generate new ways of relating to the world, but then there's this cooling down phase. Like at some point, you want to get some grip back on the world. You're able to change the grip and grip it in a different way, but you need to somehow decide what is the way you want to grip the world. What's the way how you want to relate? And while I'm not necessarily a cultural anthropologist, who I think could speak much better to this, from collaborations and from what I found in interviews and conversations, what people take out of these experiences seems to be highly culturally patterned. That people get highly suggestible in the sense of like in these high entropy states, and then the environment, the people they spend time with afterwards, the conversations they have after these states, they seem to be a pretty important contributing factor to how people then end up showing up in the world afterwards.
That's a really important point to asterisk. Back to the very first thing that I said today, which is there's a popular wave in our world today featuring jhana. Why? Because it's extreme, it's joyful. If you're coming to meditation to have peak experiences, to have really like altered state, psychedelic like experiences, the jhana training is the par excellence for that in the Buddhist contemplative program. And then look what we've just said, makes you highly suggestible, makes you highly malleable, increases the uncertainty over your whole generative model. Now, what if you're doing jhana for fun and you're not set within a program that's foregrounding compassion and love for sentient beings, it's foregrounding wisdom, consideration? I mean, that sounds to me already like information hazard, that you're sharing practices now that will maybe weaken our ability to live a better life rather than strengthen it.
Yeah, if I can just reinforce that. A lot of people are now starting to talk about these states as states of epistemic vulnerability. Not inherently good. They are states of epistemic vulnerability. And if we have the right sapiential framing around them, that makes us capable of growth. But if we don't have the right, or even if we're just lacking a framing, that vulnerability can be like other kinds of vulnerability. It can expose us to danger. It can expose us to risk. It can make us susceptible. You don't want to be doing jhana when you're surrounded by a bunch of neo-Nazis or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, this is the.
I think that's a really important point. And
I was just going to say the traditional importance of the three jewels. There's the belief in the enlightenment. That's the goal, Buddha. There's the teachings, the methods that lead you into those spaces. But then there's the Sangha. And that's the supportive community with the reciprocal feedback that keeps the normativity in place and also helps you land after you come out of them and restructure, rebuild, in the right direction, dharmically, not adharmically. So that's the container of it all.
And
within
a really
the
interesting
tradition,
experience.
Just saying within the
like a bit
Buddhist
like
tradition, yeah.
building on that, Rick. We were fortunate to have some like relationships with different more monastic environments. Where we were in Asia to explore if we want to collect data at monasteries there in Asia. We were in touch with monasteries in Myanmar, all mediated through Dharma College Berkeley, who was able to connect us to some of these long old lineages. And the question that came up very often in conversation is, do we want to do research on these states? Are these states where we want to have foreign researchers come in to then like talk about these states in a context that might not be this monastic context? Is this information that's valuable for people who haven't trained in these traditions for a long time? Do we even want to have people practicing jhanas who aren't embedded in the practice communities with wise leaders? And it's a bit of an open question, but many monks have abstained from partaking in this research because they do not think that making these states more publicly accessible or like advertising for them publicly is something that is necessarily in favor for this Buddhist training program.
Now, can I cap one thing there? Just again, because the series is a little bit about using computational frameworks to understand the different aspects of the contemplative training program. One thing that I love about your research, Jonas, is looking under the hood. You're not just advertising these states. We're looking to see the impact of these states on our kind of brain and nervous system. And your findings, I think, are the safest and best findings here, because your findings are like, look, it changes the brain and nervous system in ways that can be beneficial or detrimental. And these are the sorts of contexts where it might be more beneficial or might be less beneficial, rather than just doing, I don't know, you could imagine there are other scientific paradigms and approaches to this that might be foregrounding one thing over another, the ability to like jack up the reward system, the ability to like increase your, attachment styles. Then you might just be advertising using the, the research might point and say, look how good it is for you. I don't think your research is doing that, though. I think when we look at this computationally, we see this is a really serious, potentially dangerous, potentially extremely beneficial way of changing the generative model, of changing the brain and nervous system. I think that's actually the medicine. The medicine for the common increase in popularity is to know, look, this makes you malleable, same way as psychedelics. No, we don't think psychedelics are good for everyone. That's starting to be a part of the discussion, is that you have psychopatry tendencies. You know that these things aren't good for you. They're going to make the models too gooey. They're too gooey. You're not going to know what's going on. The same sort of thing, I think, can really become a part of the discussion by looking at this in the computational way that you are. So thanks for doing the research.
Exactly. Perfect analogy with the psychedelics and the importance of the scientific research on that in clinical environments and all of that, as opposed to this, let's all run out and do ayahuasca and mushrooms,
Yeah.
No, right.
Psychedelic tourism is a dangerous thing.
I'm being invited. Sorry, you go, John.
I was just going to say, this goes towards a lot of the work I've been doing around. There is no panacea practice, right? You always need a whole set of practices that are acting in this very complex dynamic of self-correction, and I agree with Mark, Jonas, that your work is pointing towards a really good framing of this. So it's like the market drives us towards simplification and commodification, and tell me only the good things about it. And that isn't a way of getting at the truth, and it's not actually a way of helping people. I totally concur. I think that work you've done really indicates, no, look, this is a state of epistemic vulnerability. You got to frame it right, and you got to put it into a context, and as Rick said, a tradition, if you want it to be something that is going to be a positive developmental arc for people. I think that's I just wanted to reinforce it, because this message is not getting out, even though I've been saying it quite a bit. I know Mark's been saying it. I know Rick's been saying it. Its message is not getting out, and more I worry about this, because the idea that the state or the drug or whatever is all you need, I think is destroying lives. I don't want to put anything but an exclamation mark after it. It's destroying lives. Now, I don't think we should stop doing the science. I respect the monks, but I think the best science, wedded to a good philosophical tradition, which is what the best science is, would say the kinds of things we're saying here, and that would be what I would offer to the monks. I would say, no, I don't do that kind of science. It doesn't sound like you're doing that either, Jonas. It sounds like you're doing the right kind of science.
Yeah, I love that you pointed out, John, and maybe like we looked at so many specific findings and models of this, and if we look out at this larger computational mechanics which makes up our mind, our body, our experience, we do find significant and important findings here, but none of what we find is this momentary switch and change where you just have this computational hierarchy that is just now perfect or now fixed. These are small changes. They're small incremental changes. They're the neurophysiological changes that we find. They're powerful. They're yet smaller than what pharmacological interventions can do. But the people that we work with, they've done this over years or decades, and much of the things they've learned and the way they relate to these states is something that has developed over this long time. And these are not people that are now doing these jhanas and they're like, I'm done, now I don't need them anymore. These are people that have built up to them and now use them and use them wisely. On the retreat, something that I found stunning is the people that participate in doing jhana, they weren't sitting all day in jhana. They were doing vipassana, reflections, they were doing loving kindness, and did a bit of jhana.
Yeah.
So I think just to contextualize all this is like, we can zoom in and it seems like these jhana states or whatever we look at is this powerful thing, and then we look at significance. But if we just zoom out a little bit, these are people that are like highly balanced in the types of practices they do. They have families, they kind of balance how they do families with these if they're not in a monastic context. And so I think that's something that also is a bit hard to convey in research papers, because me as a scientist, I often get obsessed with the little details, and I think that point is important.
I think it's important to do both. I mean, I think you need to do the zero-in work. But I've been arguing for a long time, a very long time. You're at the beginning. I'm near the end of my career. That we need good science needs to complement people zooming in with people that do the big picture integration. And there's all kinds of epistemological arguments to back that. We've just institutionalized, and I think we've over specialized. Not that we shouldn't be doing the specialized research. That's not what I'm saying. But we've thought that we've made it exclusive, that's all we do. We don't do the synoptic integration science as much as we should, and I think that is very, very problematic. And one of the goals, and I'm very happy, by the way, for things like predictive processing, relevance realization for ecog-sci, because they are trying to do these big picture frameworks again that give us the vocabulary and the grammar to try and draw a bunch of things together so we can address important issues like the one we're talking about right now.
Wow. What a nice, that's the soundbite for the program, right? That's the soundbite for the mini, that this framework can let us zoom out a little and look at these really complex issues in a shared language and try to get a grip on how they relate. It's lovely.
There's a parallel there between zooming in a jhana state and zooming out. It's like almost like a Neoplatonic thing, up and down the scale. No matter which way you move, the more you go in both directions, the better your functionality is overall, your cognitive flexibility in the microcosm, in the individual, and also in the science. So,
yeah, because I would argue that ultimately getting good resonance between them is what is optimal. So we should be moving towards ending this. I'm sort of hosting this, but I want to thank Mark. He was doing a lot to sort of co-host this, if I can put it that way. I always appreciate Rick being here. He always brings in just a wealth of philosophic and meditative, contemplative experience. And Jonas, it's been a great pleasure learning about your really excellent work. I hope you understand that when I was being critical and pushing, it's because I respect the work you're doing. I think it really is very, 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 very good work. But I'd like to give everybody we'll start maybe with Rick and go to Mark and then end with Jonas. A final sort of word or comment.
I'm just really delighted to have met you, Jonas, and to have read about what you're doing, and then to get to talk with you about it today. This is fascinating research. I will just kind of ditto everything that John said about the importance of it. Spectacular. Keep it up, and I'm going to keep following you now. I want copies of everything that you publish. You're doing great work. Really fascinating stuff. I wish that kind of work was going on when I was a grad student.
Thank you, Rick.
And thanks everybody for coming. I think this is a great launch episode. Thanks also, Jonas, for doing this research because it's changing my practice. Didn't get much of a chance today, but it'll come out. But I think this research can also change the way that we approach practice and the way that we're practicing these things. And it actually had an impact. I read Jonas's stuff and my practice gets better, which is a lovely feedback circuit. Because the better my practice, also the better I am, I think, at doing the science too, because I have an insider scoop. So thanks for improving my practice as your science keeps coming out, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens next, because I know you have a bunch of really exciting projects on the horizon. So so people at home who are loving this work, this is definitely the person to stay in touch with.
And maybe as the last word here, and kind of building on these last two conversations, maybe there's a little invitation for playfulness here at the end of this conversation. Mm-hmm. Just as much as we just spoke about these conversations between zooming in and sometimes taking this meta perspective, I think very similarly around what jhana meditation is, sometimes zooming into details, getting obsessed with them, and then zooming out in metacognition and let all experience re-emerge. And both in my own experience and in speaking to these practitioners, there's always a quality of playfulness in curiosity in what these experiences are. And like, as much as we can do the science here, I hope that there's still enough unexplored territory that it kind of leaves some curiosity to play with this, because at the end it is some sort of play and curiosity that really drives this contemplative journey forward. And thank you all for hosting this. It's been really beautiful to have this hour to share some of these conversations.
Thank you very much. This was wonderful. And Jonas, keep up the really excellent work. Keep it up. Great pleasure to meet you. Great pleasure to hear about your excellent work.